In emergency management, the definition of a stakeholder is any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival or recovery of a given community.
This is the Stakeholder Prepping Podcast, where the tactical comes from the practical, and today, you become your own stakeholder.
Here are your hosts, Chris and AC.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you, yes, you are the stakeholder in your own survival. And AC, I'm super excited about today's episode because we have one of the most foremost experts on infrared and navigation here to talk with us. So, AC, what can you teach us today?
Yeah, I guess I'm the expert today. This is funny because this is an episode that people have asked us about. And then you, Chris, when we talked about what episodes would you like to do in the future, this was on your list, was sort of going into the thermal imaging and night vision and things like that. So as far as thermal imaging technology goes, or EOIR, which is electro-optical infrared, I am a subject matter expert. And I teach a course all over planet Earth to some police and paramilitary organizations on sort of the tactical uses of infrared and tactical uses of thermal imaging. And I'm going to try to condense that multi-day course with a lot of, hands-on stuff and practical stuff. We're going to condense that into an hour-long podcast today.
So today's going to be a science lesson.
Today is going to be a science lesson. And unfortunately, I really think you do need to understand the science behind technologies before you can really get into the meat and potatoes of what a technology does or doesn't do. And that's ultimately what we want to teach you. So we want to talk about what are the common misconceptions about thermal imaging. What can I see? What can't I see? How can I hide myself from it? Those kinds of things. But unfortunately, we really need to understand the science first before we can even go there. And this is kind of like the guy who shows up day one at Army Basic and wants to shoot a gun. Like, unfortunately, there's some building blocks. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And specifically, we're talking about infrared, EOIR, FLIR, some of those things. We're not talking about night vision or the new super advanced night vision systems that the military is putting out and DARPA is working on and things like that. We're specifically talking about commercial, off-the-shelf, and military-grade infrared imaging software and equipment, right?
Yeah. And when I say infrared, I mean thermal infrared. And there are people that talk about midwave and shortwave infrared or near infrared. And I want to kind of draw the distinction between those things. So if we go back in the Wayback Machine and talk about history, where was infrared in general discovered? It's actually pretty cool. There's this dude, a German-born astronomer. His name was William Herschel. And Herschel was a cool dude. He, in 1800-ish, he discovered infrared light. And I've heard the story a couple different ways. I'll tell the story the way I like to tell it because I think it's cool and I hope it actually went down this way. But basically, he was trying to decide if different colors of the rainbow had different temperatures. And so what he did is he had a little pinhole into his office or laboratory or whatever astronomers use. And the light came through this little pinhole and he had it hit a prism, and that prism separated all the light into different colors. And he had these little thermometers with the bulb painted black so they would absorb energy, and he laid them all out. So he laid one yellow and one in blue and one in red to see if any temperatures or any light in the spectrum had a different temperature, if all these colors were the same temperature or not. Because his theory was that different temperature or different light colors were different temperatures. And it ended up not being the case. So the way the story goes is kind of in disgust. He just sort of tossed them aside and walked out of his office. And when he came back, one of these thermometer bulbs had rolled just slightly past the red visible light spectrum into the dark. And that thermometer bulb was warmer. And that's because this prism had separated infrared light that was invisible to his eye, but that was actually transmitting some amount of heat, and it warmed the thermometer bulb. And that, in the year 1800, was the discovery of infrared light, this light past red that we can't see. So that's kind of where it started.
Interesting. That's super cool.
Kind of cool, right? And so then, if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, it's huge. It goes all the way from gamma radiation and all the way up to like KU band satellite comms that you're probably familiar with and X band and all that kind of stuff, but it's huge, right? What our eyes see is very narrow. What we perceive is somewhere in the 380 to 750 nanometers. That's kind of from that ultraviolet to infrared spectrum. That's what our eyes see. But the spectrum itself is massive. There's so much more information available outside of the spectrum. And if you think about where infrared starts, I like to think about the home security cameras, which operate in that near IR. And a lot of people call them IR. It'll say they have IR illuminators. And you've probably seen these, Chris, where it's these little ring of very dim red bulbs, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But the camera can see them really well. So those little dim bulbs, they're actually operating outside of the wavelength that your eye can see. They usually operate around 850 nanometers, and your eye stops working at about 750. But the reason you can see those is this thing called light spectrum bleed, where as intensity goes up, so these lights are very, very bright in that 850, then they actually bleed into the visible light spectrum a little bit. And so those aren't based on thermal. That is just basically near infrared or kind of that traditional night vision. And so you get this IR spectrum bleed. And pretty much every camera on planet Earth can see into spectrums that we can't. So you could walk around with your cell phone and you could easily see anybody using an IR illuminator, like with their night vision goggles or like with these home security cameras. You can see that because your cell phone operates outside of the visible light spectrum just enough. And that's why defeating those kinds of technology is very, very easy. And a fun trick to do with the kids at home is you can take your TV remote and point that at your cell phone camera. And when you push any button on the remote, your camera will see it flashing because that TV remote is operating kind of in that same bandwidth, the same wavelength of those home security camera lights. But because it's so dim, you just can't see it with your eyes. And in the thermal world, we have something very similar to that spectrum bleed. And the best way to explain that, I guess, if you go into your kitchen and turn your stove on, assuming you have like a traditional, element type burner, when you turn that stove on, it immediately gets warm, but you can't see it. And as it gets more and more and more intense in the thermal spectrum, then you can start to see that with your eyes. It'll start to be a dim glow in that orange and red, and then it gets to what we call white hot. Well, that's simply because of that kind of spectrum bleed. But in the thermal world, we call that, it's Planck's law of black body radiation, I think. But Max Planck was a dude who came up with this Planck's curve. And basically, what it says is that as temperature increases further, the peak of that curve shifts into the shorter high energy wavelengths. And those are wavelengths that our eye can see. So that's why you can see things as they get hotter, not because you're seeing into infrared, but because the intensity of that energy actually bleeds into the visible light spectrum. Does that make sense?
I have definitely lit up a couple of barrels going cyclic and gotten them pretty bright cherry red before. But
Right.
what we what we called it in the satellite control realm was channel splash. And so you'd have a carrier wave that if it was too intense for that channel, it would start to bleed into other channels. So there were actually designated guard bands of no traffic in those guard bands so that you couldn't have a carrier from one channel bleed into a second channel and start to cut off communications for someone else. So it absolutely makes sense that it does it with light and thermal because it's all part of the IR spectrum.
Everything on the electromagnetic spectrum does this. And anybody who's ever been like on a CB before has probably heard some trucker out there with 1,000-watt linear amp bleeding on to every frequency. And it's kind of the exact same thing where, yeah, the higher that intensity goes in that particular wavelength, then it's going to bleed into other places. So that's why we can see things that get hot enough. But thermal imagers can see things at a very low temperature and a very low temperature delta. So I guess one thing that I would really like to hammer home, if there was one thing everybody learns in the next 50 minutes, would be that not all thermal imagers are created equal. There's basically two. One that you would buy commercially, like a scope for your rifle or a monocular or something. Those, or even like the little cheap ones you'd buy for a drone,
Mm-hmm.
those operate in the long wave infrared. So remember we said before your eye operates like in the 3 something to 750 nanometer. The long wave is very, very far past that. It's in the 7,000 to 14,000 nanometer, or 7 to 14 microns. So like way further and a ton more information. So this long wave infrared spectrum is kind of where all of those are going to operate. Anything you buy commercially is going to operate kind of in that bandwidth. And what those detector materials are called, it's called a bolometer. And if you remember your Greek root words from grade school and high school, bole means to strike or throw. In this context, it means like a ray of light, and meter obviously means to measure. So it's measuring a light ray or ray measurer or something, I guess. But that's kind of how those
Death
things.
beam.
Death beam, yeah, bolometer. It sounds cool. Bole. But the mid-wave infrared spectrum, that 3 to 5 micron or 3,000 to 5,000 nanometer, is generally where a lot of like the military operates. Military scopes, military helicopters are going to have thermal cameras that operate in this spectrum. So it is a different spectrum. Most of the information is the same. The different bandwidths kind of do see different things. But if you look at that in electromagnetic spectrum, you start out in visible light where we are, and then you go into that near IR that we talked about, like with the home security camera lights. And then you go into shortwave infrared, which is very weird because it's kind of like not really thermal yet. And there's some very crazy stuff we can do in that. And a lot of that the military works on is still classified within shortwave, or SWIR, what they call it. And then you move into this midwave spectrum. And that's really where most of those very high end military type stuff, where that's going to live. There are midwave cameras on the market, but really probably nothing under $10,000 or $20,000 if you're looking at like thermal scopes. If you're going buying a couple $1,000 thermal scope, that is going to be a long wave infrared camera. And the reason it's important, I think, to draw that distinction is because a lot of people will say, I'll give you an example I hear all the time, that, oh man, you can hide yourself from the military helicopters by putting a Mylar blanket on, because I tried it with my $100 thermal camera that attaches to my cell phone and I proved it. That's where I kind of want to draw this distinction between these technologies, because that's like me saying, hey, there's no way Chris made that 1,000-yard shot because I bought a BB gun and I went out and tried to do it, and there's no way you can do it. So it's
Okay.
it's different tech, and it's different sensitivities. The biggest difference is that the midwave cameras are a lot more sensitive generally. They have a little cryo cooler in them, and they cool that detector material down to, gosh, it's somewhere around as close to absolute zero as you can. I want to say it's like 100 or negative 196 degrees Celsius or something, it's like 77 Kelvin on the Kelvin scale. It's very cold.
I will say the thermal scope that we had on my Barrett, it got ice cold to the touch. And
Yeah.
it had to be a midwave then, because you'd turn it on, and if you didn't have the lithium batteries in it, those alkalines were dead in 6-7 minutes tops.
Likely was. Yeah, it likely was a cooled midwave camera, especially just because of the range that would have been required on something like that. And generally you can tell because it makes a noise. That little cooler is like a little heat pump. So you hear like a little buzz in there when it's on, because it's like a little air conditioning pump is basically how it works. It's like compressed helium, and it just compresses that gas down to where you get super duper cold. Yeah, like it's close to absolute zero as you can. And yeah, absolute zero obviously is not just really cold. It's like a fundamental physical limit according to the third law of thermodynamics. It's where molecules stop moving, and that's kind of how cold those things get. And the reason they have to get that cold is just so we can get them very, very sensitive. Because if you think about this, we're looking at a fraction of a degree temperature difference at like, miles in some cases, right? So you just need to be very, very, they get very, very sensitive because of that. And that sensitivity is rated, it's something they call it's the net delta T, or noise equivalent temperature difference. But basically, it's rated in millikelvin. So if you think about it like this, a cooled camera might have a net delta T of 20 millikelvin. What that means is it can perceive a temperature difference of 0.02 degrees centigrade.
Okay.
So from a very long ways away, you can see a very small temperature difference, where the scope that you might buy for a couple $1,000s and put on your AR or something, or a monocular, or an inspection camera that you might use, those might have a net delta T of 100 millikelvin. So you're talking about multiple times less sensitive, 5 times less sensitive, or something like that.
So could you just set up I mean, if you had the money for it, could you buy yourself an Eagle Eye system from the military, which is insanely sensitive because you could make out individual people several miles away,
Mm-hmm.
and you could tell what they were doing. You could tell if they had a hot cup of tea in their hand
Of course, yeah.
from 5 or 6 miles away. Could you do that and just set up that system and look for Bigfoot?
Absolutely. It's funny. I went to a Sasquatch symposium once. I'm not kidding.
Oh,
There is
God.
one, and the Bigfoot hunters. When you start talking about, well, here's what the Bigfoot hunters will tell you, Chris. It's a good question. Is that you can't see Bigfoot with a thermal camera because Bigfoot's fur is impervious to infrared radiation. So they've already thought about this, and the reason you can't see him is because of his special Bigfoot fur.
And the Earth is completely flat.
Yeah, and the Earth is a sheet cake. So
Yes.
I don't want to alienate any of our Sasquatch hunter listeners, but that is why they will tell you that they cannot see Sasquatch with a thermal camera. But I'll tell
DARPA
you,
needs to get a hold of some Sasquatch fur, because that
Sasquatch,
would.
exactly. If you had Sasquatch fur, then you would be able to hide yourself from anything. I think that's exactly where we need to go with this one. But I'll explain to you very quickly how a thermal camera works, and then we can get into cool stuff. So just the bare bones of how it works is the material inside that, what we call the detector, the energy comes through the lens. It hits this little detector, not very different from like the CCD in your phone or your digital camera. But that detector material is made out of something that changes resistance when light energy or heat energy hits it. In many cases, it's vanadium oxide. In the case of like the big scope on your Barrett, that was likely indium antimonide, but they have kind of the same properties. And what happens is, as energy hits them, these little individual pixels, let's say it's a 640 by 480 imager. That means there's 307,000 little pixels. And as light energy hits that array, it changes the resistance across all 307,000 of those little pixels. And then you read the resistance and then translate that to a color. Generally, it's a grayscale. And if it's an 8-bit graphic, then it's one of 256 different shades of gray. But that's what happens is light energy comes through, hits this little, we call it a focal plane array, but this little array of pixels. As the resistance changes on every single one of those 307,000 different pixels, we read it 30 times a second and then output a color difference on the display of every one of those 307,000 different pixels 30 times a second. It sounds like super scary science stuff, and it kind of is. That's why like not a lot of people make them, I guess.
Yeah, that's trippy.
It's crazy to think about that, but you're literally thinking about if you put a multimeter on either side of a little piece of gallium arsenide or indium antimonide or vanadium oxide, as you expose that to different heat and these photons of light hit it, it changes resistance, and you could measure that resistance. And you simply do that 30 times a second times 307,000 different pixels. And that's how you make the image. So that's kind of
Interesting.
It's very interesting. That is kind of the simplest way to sort of explain that. And then obviously there's all kinds of things. The normal optics rules kind of apply here when you talk about things like focal length and f number and all that. Those still apply to a thermal camera, with the exception of, I guess, the lens material is not made out of glass because thermal energy bounces off glass. Glass is very reflective to thermal energy. So the lens material is generally made out of things like chalcogenide, or germanium is a big one they use. There's some silicon lenses. So it's things you can't see through with your eyes, but thermal energy transmits very well through them. And so,
So what about something like quartz or ruby or corundum, things like that, like you'd see on a watch face?
yeah, so none of those kinds of things, those are all very still reflective to thermal, but it's funny you say that. It's actually hilarious. So sapphire does transmit some amount of thermal energy. And I had talked once with somebody, he was like a watch repair dude, and they would use thermal imagers to see if Rolexes were fake, because apparently Rolexes have a sapphire watch face. And I don't know if that's true, but basically, if you could see through the watch face, then you knew it was real because it was made out of sapphire. And if it was made out of glass, then it would be reflective to thermal and you couldn't see through.
See, that's interesting because the watch that I have on right now has a sapphire face.
Interesting. So, yeah, if you had a thermal camera, you should be able to see through that and see the hands beneath that if it is actually sapphire. And I don't know if there's different grades of like lab grown sapphire and stuff like that. I don't know how that works, but yeah, there are some precious stones that do pass some amount of thermal energy.
Yeah, I promise I'm not wearing a Rolex.
But there are a lot of things that are just very reflective to thermal energy that you don't think about. Glass is the big one. You can't see through glass. You just won't. Not in like the thermal spectrum, not in mid-wave or long wave. In those very short wavelengths, you can. And that's kind of actually how the greenhouse effect works, right? That's how greenhouses work, is that the light from the sun comes down and it's these short wavelengths. And when it hits the ground, it bounces and it gets longer. And when it gets longer into that like midwave spectrum, then it gets stuck inside the greenhouse because it can't pass through those glass or acrylic panels.
Okay,
If that
gotcha.
if that makes sense, because obviously you can bring some amount of shortwave infrared energy through glass. That's how things get warm inside, like the magnifying glass, right? But you can't see through glass with like a commercial grade or a military grade thermal imager because it's very reflective to thermal energy. And same thing with like water. Water, very reflective to thermal energy. You're not going to see anything through water. Water is always going to look very, very reflective. It generally looks cold because you're not seeing the temperature of the water. You're seeing the you're basically seeing the reflection off the water, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So when people talk about what you can see and what you can't see with a thermal camera, everything in the world has some sort of unique thermal characteristics. It's emission, at what rate does it emit thermal energy? And they call that emissivity. And then there is absorption, the rate at which it absorbs energy. And then there's reflection or reflectivity. So at what rate it reflects thermal energy. And those three things make up what's called a thermal signature. Those three things, the rate at which it's emitting energy and absorbing energy and reflecting energy. And that's all really important, especially when we start talking about like what you can see and what you can't. And the one myth I would like to dispel is the whole you can use a space blanket or a Mylar blanket to like hide from somebody with a thermal camera or the government helicopters and all that kind of thing. And I'll tell you, here's why that doesn't work. Is one, as soon as you start heating up one side of that, like putting it against your body, then your body heat is going to transmit through that. And you're going to start to see almost immediately, within a few seconds, you would start to see emission on the other side of that in the thermal wavelengths. But the other thing is that Mylar is very reflective. It has reflective thermal characteristics. So what that means is even if you could hold it far enough away from your body that you're not transmitting any energy through it, you will look like the idiot with a Mylar blanket running around. Like you're not going to blend into the background. It's very reflective to thermal energy. And anything reflective generally is going to appear much cooler because the environment around you, it's going to reflect things like the sky. Deep space is infinitely colder. We know that deep space is kind of as close to absolute zero as you can get. It's always going to look a lot cooler. So the glass thing too, people say, "Oh, you just put panels of glass around and then people can't see you." It's like, well, that's true, but then you just look like a big reflective panel of glass running around.
Yeah, and I guess that all makes sense. You don't want to look like a 5-year-old running around in a cape made of a Mylar blanket. So I guess we know what doesn't work, but what does work to hide you from thermal?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and these are things that we're actually learning right now in Ukraine with all of the drone stuff going on and people trying to hide themselves using things like Mylar blankets. That obviously doesn't work because then they just look for the Mylar blankets and they bomb those. But there are some thermal blankets that would actually work to help hide you from emitting thermal energy. There's a lot of these. I've seen ones that they're like the blankets they use for foundries, like to cool things within a foundry are one. I don't know what those are called.
Almost like a welding blanket?
Yeah, things like that. Basically, the issue with the blanket itself is that they can hold energy and sometimes they work too well. So instead, you look like your body heat is basically uh hidden enough that you're not matching the thermal delta of like the background around you. So then you would just kind of look like something either cooler or warmer than the background around you. So that's one of the biggest things. But there are, yeah, like kind of those welding blankets and things like that that they're using right now. There's also some specialty multi-layer fabrics, and there's some tactical and military ponchos and ghillie suits with these multi-layer fabrics that they're using. And these basically incorporate insulation to slow down the transfer of body heat to the outer surface. And then they have these IR emissive coatings to ensure basically the external fabric's emissivity matches that of the surrounding environment. And that's the biggest one, I think, that people figure out they can hide their heat. They don't realize that they're still not blending in with the environment. So then you just look like this anomaly, right? So the biggest thing is having these multi-layered fabrics that have air gaps. So like they're using these big thermal coats I've seen in Ukraine right now, where the coat is often loose and has sort of internal padding and spacers to create this air gap, which is an excellent insulator and prevents body heat from directly warming that outer layer, if that makes sense.
I gotcha. So, yay for asbestos?
Yeah, asbestos would be perfect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the asbestos is probably the way to go. The other thing is, think about this. You also have to breathe, and that's also a big problem because if you totally 100% cover yourself in some kind of material, then you have to breathe, and two, you're going to start warming the inside of that as you exhale. So in certain environments where maybe the ambient is somewhere around 98, 99 degrees, it's going to be a lot easier. There's also some very cool stuff I've seen like DARPA papers on that there's some graphene based systems, and there's some prototypes in development that these sort of thermal camouflage jackets where they have panels of graphene that's actually controlled by a small computer, and by applying voltage to the graphene, the thermal emissivity actually changes the way it radiates. And so that's kind of the next gen thing I think that we will probably see is actual active thermal camouflage.
That's crazy because,
Wild, huh?
I mean, any type of active, adaptable camouflage is science fiction at this
Right.
point.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's some stuff out there, and whenever DARPA admits they're working on something, they've had it deployed for like 30 years. So, the other thing I think the biggest difference between a lot of commercial grade stuff and a lot of military stuff is anybody who's worked in like HVAC or does anything with like preventive maintenance has probably used some kind of thermal imager that they're radiometric or thermographic is what they call them, and where they actually show absolute temperature. So they say, hey, this thing right here is 80 degrees or whatever. And the closer you get, the more accurate it is. But all the stuff that you would use in a tactical environment and everything you're probably going to buy for like a scope or a rifle or something like that, it's not showing absolute temperature. You have no way of knowing what the temperature of something is. You simply know that it's warmer or cooler than the thing next to it. Does that
You're
make sense?
talking about like the little thermometers that you can point the laser at your grill and tell, oh, it's at 450 degrees. Okay, I need
Yeah.
to throw the ribs on.
Yeah, those are one technology. Those are called like laser pyrometers. Same kind of thing where those are just a single pixel element that's telling you what the temperature is. But there are thermal cameras that do that exact same thing where they'll say, hey, if it's this color, it's exactly this temperature, or the little spot in the middle is exactly this temperature. And so they do have thermal cameras that do that, but those are generally built for a specific purpose. And you're not going to see those in like a tactical environment ever.
That would be more like the firefighter thermal imaging cameras where they can tell they need to get into a wall or they need to get behind so and so because there's something hot back there, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Firefighting
Okay.
cameras are a perfect example of that, where they actually have some amount of uh radiometry. They call it like rough radiometry, where they basically tell you kind of what the temperature is of the exact thing you're looking at. And all things in it's very cool because everything in the world kind of has its own particular little slice of the electromagnetic spectrum that it attenuates in, meaning that it sort of blocks the energy. And so when we talked earlier about the difference between midwave and long wave, there's a bunch of differences that I won't go into. Long wave does a little better in smoke, and midwave has a little different like solar rejection. It does a little better in fog. There's a lot of different things, but the reason they're cut up into this 3 to 5 micron and this 7 to 14 micron is that in the middle, that 5 to 7, there are no thermal imagers in the world that work in that wavelength, because that is where atmospheric attenuation happens, meaning that on planet Earth, a thermal camera wouldn't work in that spectrum because that's where the air resonates. That's where nitrogen resonates. That's where oxygen resonates. So it would just look foggy.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's
So
where that attenuation happens, is in that 5 to 7 micron.
you can't just have one camera to cover it all.
No, you can. It's different. It's completely different technology. Now there are some, we're getting into like the multispectral imaging, and there are some multispectral imagers, but not in that particular bandwidth. The only ones I've ever heard of that are built were built for NASA because they could use them in space, but they wouldn't work here. So they see some wavelength that we aren't familiar with. But yeah, in the hyperspectral or multispectral stuff, there's actually some very cool things. You may have been familiar with, Chris, the is called the SOFLAM, which is the Special Operations Force Laser Aiming Module. But you familiar with that?
Yep.
Yeah,
That's how we had to range our longest shot, 1,508 meters.
yeah, that's far. So you see those in I think it was Battlefield Los Angeles. Remember that movie? And they were carrying one of those things around.
Battle LA. Yep.
Right? Battle LA, yeah. So in that movie, they had this big square thing and they were using it to like designate a target. And so they would like, it was just a big box, and you would see like the light on the thing they wanted to like launch a missile out. But that's actually not how that thing works. How that thing works is that the laser in there, the laser designator that operates at 1.066 microns, that's invisible to your eye. And so they had a camera that attaches to the top of that on Picatinny rail mount, and it sees in two different bandwidths. It sees in that 1.066, so you can see the spot of the laser, and then it sees in the midwave, so you can basically use it as night vision or target anything that's warm. And so that's like an example of a multispectral imager where it was built to see in both bandwidths, so it could see the dot, the designator, and you could designate something and throw ordnance at it, but at the same time you could actually like see in the thermal bandwidth. So the SOFLAMs used those in that Battlefield LA or Battle LA. Yeah, they did a very bad job of what that was actually supposed to depict, but they
I
used the
still
right.
love that movie.
Great movie, yeah, and they did use the box. But I'll give you a couple of other examples of some weird hyperspectral stuff that we can do based on that attenuation.
And we definitely used our soft lamb to call in airstrikes and designate targets and guide people. Where you see the sparkle is where that RPG team
Right.
disappeared behind a wall. So
Yep.
it's a very valuable tool when you kind of use it in a multi-role situation like that. But designating targets is what it's designed for, and we did that a lot.
Right. And nowadays, with like, predator drones that can self designate and stuff, you really don't often need to have a team on the ground. You don't need to put people in harm's way to designate a target nowadays because these thermal cameras they have are what they call self designating. So it'll be a thermal camera on a helicopter or on an AC 130 gunship that would have a designator built into the camera so they can see in that thermal bandwidth, but then they can also see that spot on the target. And they don't need those guys crawling around on the ground to do it for them with something like a SOFLAM. So you don't need to do that as much anymore. I'm sure they do for some reason. If you're having a hard time getting air assets overhead, maybe there's still a reason to have that. But for the most part, a lot of these gimbaled systems they have on all these, military assets, helicopters, drones, fixed wing aircraft, they all have a self-designating gimbal. And so they don't need that guy on the ground with the laser. But there are some very cool other things that we can do with multispectral imaging. One of them is like leak detection is a really big thing now with anything basically has the CH4 molecule that propane, hexane, butane, whatever, those methane maybe, but all those kinds of things. Uh, they resonate at a certain bandwidth at 3.383 microns. So if you have this cut filter that only sees in that bandwidth, then you can see any of that attenuation. It basically looks like smoke when that odorless, colorless gas comes up. And so we can put these cut filters down and actually see things like that. That's really common. Pipeline inspection, that kind of stuff.
So is that actually how those little home gas leak detectors work? It's a light shining in there or I guess is it detecting the chemical and smelling for it, or is it detecting the chemical by light emission?
No, I think so those ones, because those are a lot less expensive, I think what those do is they are actually sniffing that particular chemical, like, they're sort of like a little mini mass spectrometer, they're looking for that particular chemical, where a thermal camera is simply seeing anything blocking, anything attenuating that image, and it's tuned to only have things block it that are those CH4 molecules, which is just kinda
Gotcha.
crazy that it works like that. But there's some really cool stuff you can start to do with kind of that hyperspectral imaging. One thing I saw, I was at a conference, and this was in the sort of the SWIR, the shortwave bandwidth, but chlorophyll, like the stuff in grass, it resonates at some low wavelength somewhere in the shortwave infrared, but with an infrared sensor that was tuned to it, you could see things like broken chlorophyll days after, say, there were troop movements or something like that. Essentially, what you could do is look at a field and you could see how many footprints walked through that field days later.
That's crazy.
It's wild. And we're talking about after there's no footprints anymore. It's simply that those broken blades of grass were emitting chlorophyll, and you could detect where that chlorophyll resonated. And so you could actually count troop movements like days after the grass had recovered. And to the naked eye, it didn't look like anything.
That's like next level LiDAR,
It
right?
is. It's
Light
crazy.
information detecting and ranging?
Yeah, exactly. So it was not active like LiDAR. It's simply you're just looking at where chlorophyll resonates. And where chlorophyll resonates, if you only look at that little tiny wavelength, then you could simply see any of those little, broken blades of grass. And those broken blades of grass were the shape of footprints.
That's nuts. So you can't hide from Big Brother with a big ass
You
thermal camera.
can't. No, it's really tough, and it is interesting, and that's kind of why I wanted to go the Mylar space blanket route was the big one. But there's plenty of other like thin film plastics, like the big black garbage bag, you can see right through that with pretty much any wavelength of thermal. So you may think that you would be blocking yourself like with a tarp because you can't see through it, but thermal will punch right through that. There's just enough energy that will transmit through some of those thin film plastics. So that's another one that you can see right through.
I'm just imagining somebody who, has the ghillie suit to defeat thermal, and they're running around looking like a Christmas tree with this big asbestos suit covered in jute and broken glass and all sorts of stuff, looking like a Christmas tree running
Right.
around.
Right, right. Yeah, you think you're gonna hide yourself, and it's oftentimes will create the exact opposite effect. And especially, it's all about your background environment. Really, is that's the biggest thing. But anyway, I don't know. I know you had a list of some of like the kind of misconceptions about thermal. Do you want to go over some of those, and I can kind of myth bust some stuff?
Yeah, so let's start with a big one. Thermal only works at night.
Yeah, that's just completely false because you're not seeing daylight at all. Thermal cameras do not see anything in daylight. They don't know when it's day or nighttime. The only thing you get is I'm speaking in general terms, is that in general terms, things heat up during the day and then they cool off at night, and things cool at different rates. And so in like a desert environment where maybe it's going to get really cold at night and you're going to get things like boulders and rocks that are going to absorb energy all day and emit it all night, the image might look a little better at night because of just the way that they call it solar loading, but the way that diurnal cycle will load up everything. But no, the thermal camera really wouldn't know. Like you could show me a photo, a thermal image, and it would be tough for me to tell you just by looking at it whether that was taken during the day or at night, unless it was, like I said, certain environments where I could probably, my eye could tell, like, oh, the way those trees are very cold and those rocks are very warm and there's no shadow, that's probably at night or something. But besides that, no, you really wouldn't know.
Okay, I like it. So what about accuracy? Talk to me about accuracy on thermal cameras.
You mean like temperature delta accuracy, or like you're talking about like using it as a scope or something like that?
Well, let's go both. Let's start with the temperature accuracy and then accuracy on a scope.
Yeah, as far as what we talked about, the net delta T, or the noise equivalent temperature delta, but the delta they could see, I would say that all things being equal, when you're talking about bringing in lenses which attenuate the image a little bit and things like that, you're generally going to see a temperature difference of somewhere around maybe zero point 0.1 degrees Celsius is probably what you're going to pick up out in the field in kind of a real world, somewhere around a tenth of a degree temperature difference. And that's kind of the me placing my hand against a wall for 3 seconds, you'll see a handprint.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
it's yeah, I mean, the amount transferring heat, it's a very small amount of temperature delta that you will see. As far as like the accuracy of a thermal scope, it's interesting because it's digital. So when you think about optics in general, and you're an expert on this stuff, and I think a lot of people listening get it, where you talk about a quarter MOA or a tenth millirad or something like that. A thermal camera, let's say you're working with a 640 by 480 imager, which is kind of high res in the thermal world. Every one of those clicks on the scope is a pixel. It's not angular. So they're accurate, but not long distance. The long range, unless like something like what you had on the 50 was probably like a hiss, that might have been a 30 or $40,000 thermal scope. But when you're talking about the couple of $1,000, the two, three, $4,000 thermal scope that you're going to go buy commercially for your AR-15, honestly, that's a 100 to 200 yard scope. And you're just limited by the technology. You're limited by the length of the lens on that thing. And so a coyote at, let's say, 200 yards is just going to be a dot. And you're limited by the adjustments you can make because it's digital. We're not talking about angular optics anymore. We're really talking about you're moving that crosshair 1 pixel up. And in many cases, that's just too much. Does that make sense?
It does, because 1 pixel is going to be the same size on your screen, but depending on your range, 1 pixel is 10 feet, 1 pixel is 80 feet. It really
Yeah.
just kind of depends on where you are. So
That,
that
that,
makes sense.
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So So yeah, unless you're really getting into those 30 and $40,000 mid-wave cooled long range optics, thermal scope for your rifle is really going to be a 100 yard, maybe 200-yard optic.
Okay. So what about the cameras that I've seen at the airport that are just kind of scanning everyone's faces, and are those
Man, yeah, that's interesting because during COVID, man, it was all about that elevated body temperature. They called it a EBT for a little bit, but then they realized you couldn't actually see body temperature and they called it EST, which was elevated skin temperature. But it's interesting because your skin is not indicative of your temperature, and whether you're sweating or not, that has a different emissivity and reflectivity characteristic and all these kinds of things. So those temperature sensors you see at the airport, and I traveled during COVID, so in foreign countries it was huge. You saw that stuff everywhere, and really there's one spot on your entire naked body where you can get a fairly accurate temperature, body temperature, and that's called your lacrimal, which is that little tear duct in the corner next to your nose. That's kind of as close as you can get to your internal body temperature. And you have to be very close because thermal cameras get far more inaccurate the further away you get. So, in those kind of situations where you're walking through the airport, man, you would have to have a 105-degree temperature before it made any difference at all. I think those were all really feel good things. But yeah, if you didn't have, say, glasses on and you had a fairly accurate radiometric camera close enough to your face, you could get pretty close to your body temperature. But the one thing you have to think about when it comes to like a fever or something like that is, plus or minus 10% is like you're either dead because you're too cold or you're dead because you're too hot. So you have to be very accurate, and they just really aren't all that accurate, at least in that environment. So I think those, especially during COVID, they were just looking like for anomalies, and they still have those. Like if you travel in China, they're all over the place looking for people with fevers. I've never seen anybody like pulled out a line because they walked by one of those things, because I just think they're not really accurate enough. I think it is a very feel goody thing.
okay? So, last myth question that I have, can you use a thermal camera to see hyperspectral ghosts into the past, into the future, anything like that?
Man, the ghost hunter stuff was just hilarious. I do laugh at that stuff. And here's no, the short answer is no. You can't see any of that stuff. You just can't. I'm sorry. I know it's cool to like think that you're, seeing your old dead great aunt Millie walking around the house, but you're just not. Those anomalies, really what a lot of people don't understand about a thermal camera, and this comes back to the science, is how reflective many surfaces in your home are to thermal energy and not to the visible light spectrum. And I'll give you a couple of examples, but like your TV with your eyes, obviously you can see whatever's on TV, and when it's off, it's just black and it's not very reflective. But something like that, very reflective in the thermal spectrum. So if you took a thermal camera, any cheap thermal camera, any of them, and pointed at your TV, it would act as a mirror. And things that are less reflective, maybe less glossy, they just kind of look like a foggier mirror. And I'm looking around in my room that I'm in right now, where like my gun safe, it's not really a satin. Maybe it has a little bit of a reflective coating on it. That paint would be very reflective to thermal energy. I could probably see my own reflection with a thermal camera in the safe, a glossy picture, a poster, if you will, even like a whiteboard is something I've seen. Like you got a whiteboard up that is very, very reflective to thermal energy. Those photons of light hit that and they bounce off at some rate. And so things in your home that you don't realize are very reflective in one wavelength, and they're not reflective to, say, the visible wavelength. If you took a thermal camera and you're looking for ghosts, you're going to see a ghost in your refrigerator door. You're going to see a ghost in every poster. You're going to see a ghost in every whiteboard. Anything that's basically glossy is going to reject some amount of those photons of light that hit it. And in a thermal camera, you'll see them. And when I watch any of those like ghost hunter shows, yeah, I mean, I can pick it out. You see it. You're like, oh, what was that apparition? I'm like, well, you walked by a poster and it was glossy. And so the camera picked up kind of this foggy apparition because it's true that everything glossy, I'm not kidding, your car, everything glossy in your world is a foggy mirror to a thermal camera.
See, that's kind of cool because now I just want to go around with like high gloss spray paint and
It will
paint
just, yeah,
the outside of the house so that thermal cameras can't see in.
everything glossy will just be very reflective rather than, it's this kind of triangle like I talked about earlier where there's reflectivity and there's emissivity and then there's this absorption. So everything in the world does some amount of those three things, and the more reflective it is in thermal, the less probably emissive it is, and the less it absorbs thermal energy. But any of those glossy things, yeah, man, you're gonna see those kind of like a foggy mirror in a thermal camera. So whenever I watch any of those like ghost hunter shows, that's pretty common. And I'll tell you, I've also been out at night with a thermal camera like on a rifle, and there's a lot of stuff out there that you just don't see. There are bugs flying around that are going to excite that thermal imager. There's little mice hopping around on the ground that you're not going to see. And when you see them in the scope and you don't see them with your eyes, it does kind of freak you out. But unfortunately, those aren't ghosts.
So, for our listeners, is it worth getting a thermal imaging scope or a thermal imaging camera, or is thermal the way to go? I know we're going to talk about night vision in a different episode, but would you say that it's worth the 3 to 5,000 for a rifle scope for purchase?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. And I'm not an expert in like weapon sights really. My expertise lies in some other integrated system and imaging type tech, but what I would say is yes, I think having a thermal camera, having a thermal weapon sight is worth it in some instances. What I would say is it definitely has to be dedicated. What I do with mine is I have a thermal weapon sight that I have an AR-15 upper that's dedicated to that weapon sight. I don't take it off because it is digital, and it's just, even if those mounts and rings and everything are perfect, it's still going to lose zero pretty well anytime you try to touch that thing. So having a dedicated optic to that rifle, or at least to that upper that never comes off, I would say that yes, that is probably worth it. Anytime you want to shoot and it's pitch black, remember it works on contrast. So that's the coolest thing is with night vision, even white phosphorus, the coolest, best night vision out there, you can still camouflage yourself pretty easily. But with a thermal camera, man, that guy in a ghillie suit is going to look like a light bulb. And so I think there is utility in having a thermal weapon sight in sort of the preparedness world. Also, just a monocular is a great thing to have. Another thing you can do is they do make thermal cameras that have that, is it called a Munz rail? What's the rail for the helmet mounted bridge?
I
I think
believe it's called a men's rail, but
I
I'm
think it's
not
a Munz
100%
rail, that
sure.
that little dovetail thing, but I've seen a lot of people run, rather than like 2 PVS-14s, which is the Gen 3 night vision, running 1 PVS-14 and 1 thermal camera. And that's actually what I have. I've got a very wide field of view, so very short range thermal camera that I can run on a helmet. And it's amazing that when you put those two things together, your brain actually does make it real. Like, it's pretty cool. If you wear that thing for 10 minutes, your brain really does sort of blend that PVS-14 and the thermal camera. The one thing about thermal camera is it's just got a very small little eyepiece, and so it doesn't really have as wide of a field of vision as the night vision does. So you basically overlay one on the other. But yeah, that's something that you can do if you have the money for it. Man, it's pretty impressive to put those things together for sure.
Nice. Well, thank you for walking us through the infrared and everything that you do with it.
I feel like we didn't really scratch the surface, but yeah, that it gives people kind of an idea how this stuff works, and I could just go forever, but that's kind of the idea. Like I said, just so you understand that from like a tactical operation standpoint and the uses of thermal cameras, this would be maybe like a 3-day long course with actually like practical hands-on stuff. So this is very condensed.
Super condensed. I like it. Well, I definitely learned a whole bunch of things. I'm sure our listeners did. And Join us next week. Again, we're going to go in a completely new and different direction. Next week is going to be a little bit unconventional, so I think we'll all get a kick out of that. But until then, remember, you are your own stakeholder. We'll see you then.